So now we're going to look at the constitutional reforms that have happened since 1997. 1997 being the introduction of New Labour and the Blair government. Okay, so first of all, we're going to just quickly brush over human rights because we looked at the human rights and civil liberties in the last video. But the Human Rights Act enshrined most of the provisions of the ECHR. The Human Rights Act requires British government to ensure that legislation is compatible with the Convention, and all bills introduced at Westminster must receive a declaration of compatibility with the ECHR from lawyers. UK courts can declare legislation incompatible with the ECHR and overturn executive decisions. This was all covered in the last video in a lot more detail. Exactly. So let's have a look more at other aspects of constitutional reform since 1997. Firstly, devolution. Devolution involves the transfer of powers, legislative and executive, and tax-raising powers from the central government to subnational institutions. In 1999, power was devolved to new institutions in Scotland, Wales and Northern Ireland, following yes votes in referendums in each nation. The Scottish Parliament has primary legislative and tax-varying powers. It and the Scottish Government have sole responsibility for policy issues such as education, health and local government. So we now have, apart from Westminster, we now have legislatures in Scotland, the Scottish Parliament, we have the Northern Ireland Assembly and also the Welsh Assembly. And we also have the London Assembly as well. So devolution has spread across the UK. The Kalman Commission 2007 to 2009 recommended the devolution of further powers. So the Conservative and Liberal Democrat coalition enacted these changes. The National Assembly for Wales was initially weaker. It has secondary legislative and executive powers, but it didn't have any primary legislative authority. So in 2006, Labour paved the way for the Assembly to gain primary legislative powers, which duly concurred after a referendum in 2011. So Wales then got more devolved legislative powers later on throughout the years. Okay, so what are the constitutional implications of devolution? Well, devolution has a significant impact on the traditional constitutional settlement. The UK no longer fits the classic definition of what we would call a unitary state, although even in the pre-devolution UK, it was more of a union state. Nor does it fit the standard definition of a federal state. A federal state being a state that is split into subgroups and smaller states. For this reason, it is argued that the UK is what we call a quasi-federal state, part of a federal, partly federal and partly unitary. So an example of a federal state, we could say, is the USA, they have a federal government, which is the presidency and Congress and the Supreme Court. But they also have state governments, and then within that they also have local governments. So there's layers to the different governments and legislatures within the USA. We have what we call a quasi-federal state, where we don't quite have that same federal aspects to our constitution, but at the same time we cannot argue that it's unitary anymore either. Devolution has also raised questions about how England should be governed. There is no simple answer to what we call the West Lothian question, which asks, why do Scottish MPs at Westminster get to vote purely on English matters when English MPs can no longer vote on matters of devolved to the devolved Scottish Parliament? So effectively, Scotland has a say in English matters, but England doesn't have a say in Scottish matters, effectively, which is what the West Lothian question is. There's also been a case of decentralisation since 1997. So the Blair government's also made changes to local government in England, notably in London. An executive mayor was was created and had powers such as the environment and transport, the latter leading to the creation of what was the congestion charge in London for motorists entering central London. This was under Ken Livingstone, the London mayor. All local authorities were obligated to reform their political management, but by 2010 only 12 had adopted the government's preferred option of a directly elected mayor. Okay, so there was a little bit of decentralisation within the UK government. There's also been an air of electoral reform. So the Blair government's record on electoral reform has been a mixed one. Proportional representation was introduced for elections to the Scottish Parliament, to the Welsh Assembly, and to the Northern Ireland Assembly, and the European Parliament. However, there was no action taken to reform the first-past-the-post system in general elections. But in 2011, following the Blair government, we find that a referendum was called to reform first-past-the-post and replace it with the alternative vote. But this was not to be the case since the AV side didn't win the referendum. There's also been significant reform in Parliament. The House of Lords Act of 1999 abolished the rights of all but 92 hereditary peers. The Lords now comprise mainly of life peers. No political party had an overall majority. But the Labour government's made little progress to stage 2 of the reforms, when the final composition of powers of the reformed House of Lords should be settled. MPs and peers rejected a series of options for reform, including all appointed House of Lords, a completely appointed system, and a hybrid house containing both elected and appointed peers. So we still haven't made headway on the on electing our House of Lords. They are still appointed. In 2007, MPs voted for an 100% elected or an 80% elected House of Lords, but no legislation followed in the short term. Blair's initiatives to reform the House of Commons were less spectacular than the House of Lords. Changes to Prime Minister's question times and working hours of the Commons, plus additional sittings in Westminster Hall, modernised proceedings. The Brown government gave a greater priority to reforming the House of Commons. The 2010 Governance of Britain Green Paper aimed to limit the powers of the executive and make it more accountable to Parliament. So now we're going to look at the reform of the House of Commons Committee. This was chaired by Tony Wright, and it recommended that chairs of select committees should be elected by backbenchers, that a backbench committee should determine the business of the House of Commons for 1 day a week, so the backbench business committee, and also a procedure petitions committee should select issues a debate that have been suggested by a public via e-petitions. This is the famous 100,000 votes and it gets read in Parliament e-petition that goes around the UK. The judiciary has seen a number of reforms. We've looked at the Constitutional Reform Act, which is focused on judicial reform. The Supreme Court, which started work in 2009, became the UK's highest court and removed the judicial role from the House of Lords, i.e. the Appellate Commission of the House of Lords. This enhanced the separation of powers, but the Supreme Court does not have the authority to strike down legislation. It doesn't have that power of judicial review quite like the American system. The government had intended to abolish the office of the Lord Chancellor and so bring about the separation of legislative, executive and judicial functions of the office. The Lord Chancellor was a member of the Cabinet. In the executive, he was a Speaker of the House of Lords in the legislature, and he was also head of the executive. So he sat in all three branches of government. Finally, we got to look at Brexit. However, Brexit hasn't, as at time of recording, Brexit hasn't actually hasn't happened. We are still part of the European Union. However, a number of constitutional grey areas has been filled in by the Brexit referendum in recent years. We'll look at Brexit itself and the impact that it will have, and then we'll look at what has happened in Brexit recently. So no matter the deal we have with the European Union, Brexit will have a huge impact on the European Constitution. According to Article 50 of the TFU, Treaty of the European Union, the treaties of the European Union will no longer apply to the UK from the date of entry into force of the withdrawal agreement, or failing that, 2 years after notification. It's now nearly 3 years because we've asked for extensions and other things have occurred along the way. A quote-unquote no-deal Brexit would arguably have the largest impact on the UK constitutions. It will remove one of the 5 sources of the UK constitutions, and it will also break the precedent of decisions made by the European Court of Justice. And there'll be more videos relating to the EU later on. But there have also been other constitutional grey areas that have been covered by Brexit negotiations. So earlier this year, in 2019, Parliament, for the first time in history, the government was held in contempt of Parliament for refusing to release legal information about the Brexit negotiations. We also have the Gina Miller case that required the government to get permission from Parliament before enacting Article 50. And now we have the second Gina Miller case, Miller v. the Prime Minister, Boris Johnson, which is going as we speak, which the central question is, is the UK Supreme Court able to have jurisdiction over matters of the prerogative and the prorogation of Parliament, which happened a couple of weeks ago. So, i.e., is this issue justiciable? And then the second point is, if this issue is justiciable, did the Prime Minister act unlawfully in the advice given to the monarch in order to secure a prorogation of Parliament? Okay, now these are issues that you should be following because these are huge. They have huge constitutional impact. So the fact that the first main constitutional impact is asking whether or not the Supreme Court has jurisdiction in areas of the prerogative. This will have set a precedent that will be followed for years to come. And the second would be whether or not the Supreme Court can then say whether or not the Prime Minister was unlawful in his attempt to give advice to prorogue Parliament. So Brexit has brought a number of constitutional changes, and so cannot be ignored when it comes to looking at constitutional reform.